The sky above New York City was a swirling mass of gray and silver, storm clouds rolling in with the promise of turbulence. Rain tapped against the windows of the Atlantic Airways jet as it sat on the tarmac, the sound both soothing and ominous. The plane, a sleek silver bird against a darkening sky, waited impatiently for its turn to take off. Inside, the air was thick, not just with humidity, but with an intangible tension that seemed to hum beneath the steady drone of the engines. In the first-class cabin, passengers settled into wide leather seats, their faces a mixture of practiced calm and subtle unease. Businessmen in crisp suits adjusted their ties, an elderly couple whispered to each other, and a young woman stared blankly at the safety card as if trying to decode a secret message. Each had their own story, their own destination, yet today, they were all bound by the invisible threads of fate, weaving a tale none of them could see coming. The flight crew moved with precision, their smiles tight, their movements sharp. Jessica Malone, the lead flight attendant, strode down the aisle, heels clicking softly against the carpet. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a perfect twist, her uniform impeccable. But behind the polished exterior, her mind raced, each step an effort to suppress the gnawing anxiety that had plagued her for weeks. Jessica's eyes flitted over the passengers, pausing briefly on a black woman seated by the window. Naomi Grant sat with a quiet, composed expression, her fingers gently tapping on her phone. She wore a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, nothing flashy, nothing out of place. Yet, something about her drew Jessica's attention. A sense of stillness, an unreadable calm amidst the growing storm. As the plane began to taxi, a soft rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. The story, like the storm, was just beginning. Naomi Grant sat quietly in her first-class seat, her posture relaxed but deliberate. She seemed to melt into the leather upholstery, a study in calm amidst the controlled chaos of the boarding process. Her fingers moved rhythmically on her tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be a mundane news app. To any casual observer, she was just another passenger, perhaps a business traveler lost in her own world. But beneath her serene exterior, Naomi's mind was an intricate web of observation and analysis, each flicker of her gaze capturing details most would overlook. She noted the loose overhead bin 2 rows back, the slight bulge in a flight attendant's jacket pocket, the delayed reaction of the man by the emergency exit when the safety briefing began. Her awareness was not born of anxiety, but of training. 15 years with the CIA, where noticing the unnoticed often meant the difference between success and disaster. At 42, Naomi had built a career on her ability to blend in while seeing everything. Today was no different. Her mission, however, was anything but ordinary. Moving through the cabin with a practiced smile was Jessica Malone, the lead flight attendant. At 35, Jessica had perfected the art of looking polished and in control. Her uniform was pristine, the navy blue fabric pressed to perfection, her blonde hair held in a tight bun that framed her face like a mask. But if Naomi was a lake of still waters, Jessica was a river with a riptide beneath the surface. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, and the subtle stiffness in her movements betrayed a deeper unrest. Jessica's life had not turned out as she'd imagined. She had dreamed of promotions, perhaps a move to corporate, but those doors had remained closed, leaving her in a holding pattern. She had watched younger, less experienced colleagues rise while she remained stuck at 300 feet, serving drinks and forced smiles. Her bitterness had begun to harden into something sharper, a resentment that found easy targets in those who reminded her of where she thought she should be. Naomi caught Jessica's eye as the flight attendant passed, offering a polite nod. Jessica's return smile was tight, her knuckles white against the handle of the drink cart. She moved past Naomi, but something about the encounter lodged in her mind. A woman too calm, too confident. Jessica's thoughts spiraled, each loop tightening with suspicion. She had learned over the past few months to trust those instincts. After all, they had kept her safe in her side hustle, a dangerous game of transporting small, well-sealed packages for people who paid well to remain unseen. It was just past cruising altitude when the incident unfolded. Jessica, emboldened by a growing sense of desperation and an instinct to deflect attention from herself, marched to the front of the cabin. Her voice cut through the hum of the engines, loud and clear. "Excuse me, everyone," she announced, holding up a small vacuum-sealed package. "This was found under a seat. I believe it contains illegal substances." Her eyes landed on Naomi. It was under her seat. A ripple of shock passed through the cabin. Passengers turned in their seats, phones appeared in hands, and whispers buzzed like trapped flies. Naomi did not flinch. She looked up from her tablet, her expression as calm as ever. "That's not mine," she said simply, her voice carrying just enough for those around her to hear. Jessica's face hardened. "Security will need to take a look at your belongings, ma'am." Her tone was cool, but a sheen of sweat glistened at her hairline. As airport security was called to the plane, Jessica's chest tightened with a mix of triumph and fear. She had made her move, but somewhere deep down, beneath layers of bravado and bitterness, a quiet voice whispered a warning. Naomi, still seated, watched Jessica with an expression that felt like a quiet promise. "You have no idea what you've just done," Naomi murmured, too softly for anyone but Jessica to hear. The first-class cabin fell into a strained silence, the kind that made every small sound feel like an intrusion. Eyes darted between Naomi and Jessica, searching for signs of danger or deception. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit clutched his briefcase a little tighter, his lips pressing into a thin line. An elderly woman with pearl earrings exchanged a worried glance with her husband, their hands entwined as if holding on to a lifeline. A young professional, phone already recording, tilted his screen to catch both women in the frame, his expression a mix of fear and anticipation. Whispers threaded through the cabin, soft but sharp. "Did she really bring drugs on board? I knew something was off the moment I saw her. You can never be too careful these days." The assumptions slid easily from their tongues, the narrative already writing itself. A composed black woman, a suspicious package, a flight attendant's accusatory gaze. Prejudice danced just beneath the surface, subtle but unmistakable, like the low rumble of turbulence before the real storm hits. Naomi's reaction only deepened the unease. Where most would show fear or indignation, she remained still, her hands resting gently on her tablet. Her calmness seemed unnatural, a quiet strength that unnerved those looking for signs of guilt. Her dark eyes met Jessica's, and in that locked gaze there was no plea, no denial, just an unsettling steadiness. Jessica, still clutching the package, felt the weight of every stare. What she had expected to be a swift and validating moment now stretched on, her confidence wobbled by Naomi's unflinching composure. She opened her mouth to speak again, to regain control, but Naomi's voice cut through the silence, soft but certain. "You have no idea what you've just done." The words hung in the air, sharp and cold, like a blade catching the light. In that instant, the roles seemed to shift. Jessica no longer the accuser, Naomi no longer the accused. The story, once simple, had become something far more dangerous. Naomi Grant had learned from an early age how to walk the fine line between visibility and invisibility. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, she had seen firsthand how being noticed could be both a blessing and a curse. Her mother, a nurse, often came home exhausted but determined, recounting stories of patients who had seen past her scrubs to the color of her skin, as if it somehow clouded her competence. Her father, a history teacher, spent long evenings preparing lessons on civil rights and quiet resilience, planting seeds of strength in Naomi and her younger brother. He taught them that history was a mirror, and those who held it steady could shape how the world saw them. Naomi had an innate gift for observation. As a child, she could read a room before anyone else even knew there was a story to tell. At school, she noticed which teachers made eye contact with every student and which ones skipped over the desks in the back. She watched how the security guards at the mall treated her white friends differently, how sales clerks hesitated just a moment longer before offering help. These experiences layered themselves into her personality. a quiet mosaic of awareness and restraint. Her path to the CIA was not straightforward. Naomi had to outwork, outsmart, and outlast. In Quantico, where her peers often underestimated her, she excelled. Her background in behavioral psychology made her an expert in reading micro-expressions, those fleeting moments when truth slipped through the cracks of someone's facade. She became known for her almost supernatural ability to sense danger before it arrived, a skill that earned her the codename Oracle among her colleagues. Her career was a series of strategic moves. Naomi infiltrated circles in Eastern Europe where silence was currency, and she brokered peace in regions where speaking up could get you killed. She had walked through crowded marketplaces and felt the ripple of unrest before a riot broke out. She had stared down operatives who would later find themselves exposed, their secrets laid bare by a woman they had dismissed as just another bystander. Rising through the ranks, she shattered expectations and ceilings alike, becoming the head of the CIA's Covert Aviation Security Division. Her mission on this particular flight was not about proving herself, she had done that 1,000 times over, but about protecting those who never got the chance. In stark contrast, Jessica Malone's journey was one of dissent. She had not always been the woman who weaponized prejudice to mask her own failings. Once, she had been bright-eyed and ambitious, a young flight attendant who believed the world was hers for the taking. Jessica had grown up in a small town in Ohio, where life moved at the pace of the rusting riverboats, and dreams rarely drifted far from home. She had escaped to the skies, thrilled by the idea of a life above the clouds, where every takeoff felt like leaving her troubles behind. For the first few years, she thrived. Her natural charm earned her compliments from passengers and praise from supervisors. But as time wore on, the shine began to dull. Promotions that once felt within reach slipped through her fingers, handed instead to younger attendants, to those who brought new ideas and fresh energy. Jessica's career became a loop of long flights and layovers where the scenery changed, but her reality remained grounded. She watched as a new generation of diverse talent rose through the ranks. Flight attendants with bold curls, pilots with accents, managers whose experiences were not the same as hers. What started as quiet disappointment curdled into resentment. Jessica began to see herself as a casualty of a world that no longer valued her sameness. She started to believe in a twisted narrative, one where her stagnation was not a consequence of her choices, but of someone else's advancement. The bitterness found fertile ground in her growing financial troubles. Credit card bills piled up, and the facade of her perfectly polished life began to crack. It was during this vulnerable time that she was approached by a man in first class, a passenger with an offer too good to refuse. The job was simple: move packages through security, no questions asked. The money was quick, the risk seemed low, and, more importantly, it gave her a sense of control, a feeling she had not tasted in years. Jessica told herself it was just a stopgap, a temporary detour until things turned around. But each transaction pulled her further into the dark. The fear of being caught gnawed at her, and the need to deflect suspicion became a reflex. She began to notice patterns: who drew attention, who slipped by unnoticed. It did not take long for her to recognize that passengers of color, particularly those who seemed too composed, too self-assured, often bore the brunt of scrutiny. She rationalized her actions with the insidious comfort of stereotypes, believing that if anyone needed to take the fall, better them than her. By the time Naomi Grant boarded her flight, Jessica was a woman balanced on the edge of her own unraveling. The moment their eyes met, something shifted. Naomi's calm was a mirror Jessica could not look away from. It showed her everything she had lost: her integrity, her empathy, her sense of who she once was. And so when the opportunity arose, when Jessica found herself holding the small, incriminating package, the choice felt almost inevitable. She cast the stone, not seeing the ripples of consequence that would follow, not knowing that beneath Naomi's still waters, there was a force ready to pull her under. As the plane taxied to a stop, the first-class cabin remained a theater of silent judgment. Naomi Grant, hands resting calmly on her lap, maintained an air of unshakable composure. To the untrained eye, she appeared every bit the poised professional, quiet, reserved, perhaps even resigned. But beneath that stillness, a quiet storm was brewing, and Naomi was anything but powerless. Unseen by everyone, a tiny pin on Naomi's lapel, a simple, unassuming accessory, was no ordinary piece of jewelry. It was a state-of-the-art CIA recording device, designed for covert operations. Equipped with a high-definition camera and an encrypted live feed, the pin had captured every detail of the unfolding incident. From the moment Jessica had slipped the small package into Naomi's bag, to the calculated way she had staged its discovery, nothing had escaped its lens. Miles away in a secure operations room at CIA headquarters, Director Paul Hatcher watched the live feed with a grim expression. The room was dimly lit, the glow of monitors casting long shadows on the walls. Agents moved quietly, their faces reflecting the unfolding drama as Naomi's camera continued to stream every second. Hatcher's fingers tapped rhythmically on the polished table, a measured beat that echoed his tightly controlled anger. "Zoom in on her hand," he instructed, his voice a low rumble. A tech analyst complied, enhancing the image. On the screen, Jessica's hand could be seen slipping the package under the edge of Naomi's seat cushion, her movements quick, but not quick enough. The recording captured everything. The shift of Jessica's eyes, the slight tremor in her fingers, the calculated look she shot Naomi as if testing whether her trap had been noticed. Hatcher leaned forward, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the screen. "She knows," he murmured, a hint of admiration threading through his frustration. Naomi's expression, even when confronted, remained controlled, her voice steady as she delivered her chilling line, "You have no idea what you've just done." The director straightened, his mind already racing through the protocol. "Get in touch with airport security. I want that plane held on the ground. No one disembarks until my team gets there." His orders were met with swift action. The room filled with quiet, efficient movement. Phones ringing, keyboards clacking, and the hushed voices of agents coordinating with ground teams. Despite the urgency, Hatcher allowed himself a brief moment to reflect. He had chosen Naomi for this mission because of her unmatched instincts, her ability to blend into any environment while seeing through every disguise. Her calm under pressure was legendary within the agency, and watching her now, he felt a surge of vindication. She was not just documenting the crime, she was setting the stage for a controlled detonation, one that would expose the truth in a way no one could deny. The live feed continued, capturing Jessica as she moved through the cabin, her confidence growing with every second. She had no idea that her carefully orchestrated performance was being transmitted directly to the highest levels of government. Naomi's camera captured the glances between Jessica and a man seated near the back. A contact, perhaps? The wheels in Hatcher's mind turned, cataloging every potential lead. He would not only take down Jessica, but also dismantle the entire network if it existed. As the plane came to a complete stop, the camera feed showed security personnel approaching the aircraft. Passengers stirred, curiosity mixing with confusion. Hatcher's voice cut through the room again. "Tell them to approach her quietly. We need this clean." His fingers tightened around the edge of the table, knuckles pale against the dark wood. "And make sure Agent Grant knows we've got her back." The screen now showed Jessica's face, still frozen in a mask of feigned concern as the security team stepped onto the plane. The scene was set, the actors in place, and Hatcher knew that in a matter of minutes, the truth would erupt with the force of a controlled explosion. The only question left was how far the blast radius would extend, and who else might be caught in its path. Naomi sat in the cold, stark holding cell, her back straight against the metal bench. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, the only sound in an otherwise empty space. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, her breathing slow. In the stillness, Naomi reviewed every moment of the flight. She mentally cataloged each detail, Jessica's too bright smile, the subtle shift in her tone when addressing different passengers, the way her hand lingered near Naomi's seat just a second too long. Naomi had seen it all through the lens of experience, each action fitting into a larger puzzle that was now beginning to reveal its shape. The hidden camera had captured everything. The truth was not just on her side, it was in her pocket, streaming live to the CIA headquarters. Back on the plane, Jessica's confidence was beginning to unravel. What had initially felt like a victory now seemed precarious. She moved through the cabin, offering strained smiles and forced reassurances. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee, the liquid sloshing over the rim of the cup. Passengers exchanged glances, subtle at first but growing bolder as doubt spread like a slow burn. A woman in a floral scarf whispered to her seatmate, "Did you see the way she looked at that woman? It felt wrong." The man beside her, who had initially been among the first to nod approvingly when Jessica made the accusation, now looked away, a hint of shame coloring his cheeks. Further back, a teenager with earbuds only half inserted caught snippets of conversation and turned his phone's camera toward Jessica, his curiosity shifting into something sharper. Jessica could feel the weight of their gazes, no longer supportive but questioning. She tried to distract herself, checking her phone, but the screen offered no comfort. Messages from her contact remained unanswered. The reality of what she had done tightened around her chest like a vice. She had expected to feel relief, a sense of control. Instead, a quiet panic began to pulse beneath her skin. Her interactions with the crew became clipped. When a fellow flight attendant asked if she was all right, Jessica snapped, "I'm fine," the words sharp enough to draw attention from nearby passengers. The attendant recoiled, murmuring a soft apology, but the exchange did not go unnoticed. The whispers grew louder, spreading through the cabin like a contagion. Jessica's anxiety sharpened each sound: the click of a seatbelt, the rustle of a newspaper, the low hum of someone's headphones. She imagined every look, every tilt of a head was aimed at her. The plane, which had felt like a stage for her performance, now seemed to close in around her, each row of seats a jury box, every passenger a judge. In the quiet of her cell, Naomi remained unshaken. She knew the power of silence, how it allowed truths to surface. She had used this strategy countless times in interrogation rooms, letting her suspects' own words ensnare them. And now, without lifting a finger, she was doing it again, letting Jessica's guilt rise to the surface, the truth unraveling not with a bang, but with the slow, inevitable pull of gravity. Back on the plane, the shift in the cabin's energy was undeniable. Jessica's rehearsed facade was cracking, and the passengers sensed it. Where there had been a quiet acceptance of her story, now there was a questioning, a collective awareness that something was not adding up. The balance of power had shifted, and Naomi, miles away and surrounded by concrete and steel, held the scale firmly in her hands. The quiet hum of the holding cell was interrupted by the soft click of a door opening. Naomi Grant lifted her head slowly, her expression serene as Director Paul Hatcher entered the room. His presence was a force of calm authority, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing outside. Without a word, he sat across from her, his hands folded neatly on the metal table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was a silent exchange, a language only two seasoned operatives could share. "Everything is in place," Hatcher said, his voice measured. "The feed was clear, we got it all." Naomi allowed herself a small nod, a subtle acknowledgement that the first phase of her mission had succeeded. Hatcher leaned back, his expression softening. "They think you're just another passenger, but they're in for a surprise. This isn't about a single flight attendant gone rogue, is it?" Naomi's calm exterior held, but her eyes sharpened. "Jessica Malone is just a small part of a much larger machine," she began. "The package she planted wasn't a random choice. It's part of a specific batch we've been tracking for months, high-grade pharmaceuticals bound for the black market. The operation stretches beyond this flight and even this airline. It's a coordinated effort involving a corporate-level smuggling ring with ties to several major cities." Hatcher's jaw tightened. "We suspected as much, but your footage confirms it. The packaging matches shipments intercepted in Miami and Seattle. It's not just about the drugs. They're using legitimate cargo shipments as cover, blending them with everyday products. The airline's logistics department is either complicit or dangerously negligent. Naomi unfolded her hands, her fingers brushing the cool metal of the table. Jessica's been the mule, but she's not the architect. There's someone higher up, someone feeding her desperation and using her bias as a shield. The real target is the network that's exploiting her and others like her, leveraging their vulnerabilities and weaponizing prejudice to deflect suspicion. Hatcher's expression turned grave. We've been monitoring corporate communications. There are encrypted messages between senior executives and anonymous accounts. They're laundering the money through a web of shell companies, making it nearly impossible to trace without an insider. His eyes met Naomi's, a shared understanding passing between them. That's why you were on that plane, not just to catch a flight attendant, but to crack open the entire operation. A faint smile touched Naomi's lips. They think I'm just another passenger? That's their first mistake. Their second is underestimating how far I'm willing to go. She leaned forward slightly, her voice a low, deliberate whisper. Jessica's move to frame me wasn't just about covering her tracks. She was following orders. Someone told her to do it, to create a distraction while a larger shipment passed through unnoticed. Hatcher's eyes narrowed. And did it? Naomi's expression remained inscrutable. Not this time. But the attempt tells us everything we need to know. They're getting bolder, taking bigger risks. If we push now, we could force them into the open. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. But we need to move carefully. Jessica's just the tip of the iceberg. The real danger lies beneath the surface. Hatcher stood, his movements smooth and purposeful. We've already grounded the plane. Agents are on board, questioning passengers and crew. We'll bring Jessica in, but we need to keep this quiet. The last thing we want is to tip off the higher-ups before we're ready. He hesitated, a rare slip in his usually unshakable demeanor. Are you ready to see this through? Naomi rose, her stance mirroring his. I was ready the moment I stepped on that plane. Her voice was firm, a quiet resolve threading through each word. We're not just exposing a smuggler, we're tearing down the whole network. As they exited the holding cell, the steel door closed behind them with a resonant click, the sound a prelude to the unraveling of an international conspiracy. Naomi's mission had shifted from defense to offense, and the game was no longer about proving her innocence. It was about bringing a hidden empire to its knees. The air in the terminal felt thick with anticipation as the sleek black SUVs rolled to a stop outside the gate. Their dark windows reflected the stormy sky, mirroring the turbulence that was no longer just outside, but had taken root within the walls of the airport. Director Paul Hatcher stepped out first, his expression a fortress of calm. Flanking him were federal agents, their movements precise and unyielding. Passengers behind the glass barrier murmured and pointed, their confusion growing as uniformed officers moved into position, blocking exits and setting a perimeter. Inside the plane, the atmosphere had shifted from mild discomfort to full-blown anxiety. Jessica Malone paced the aisle, her hands clutching a tablet as if it could shield her from what was coming. The passengers, who had initially rallied behind her, now watched with wary eyes. The older woman in the floral scarf pulled it tighter around her shoulders, her earlier whispers of judgment replaced by a hollow silence. The businessman who had clutched his briefcase now held it with loose fingers, his attention fully on the door to the cockpit, as if expecting an announcement that never came. Jessica's mask of control cracked further when the intercom clicked on. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are currently experiencing a security situation. Law enforcement will be boarding the aircraft. Do not leave your seats until instructed. The pilot's voice was calm, but the message set off a chain reaction of sharp breaths and exchanged glances. Jessica's pulse thudded in her ears, drowning out the cabin sounds. Her carefully laid plans, once so solid, now felt as fragile as the plastic cup she had crushed earlier. The plane door opened and Director Hatcher stepped inside. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he surveyed the cabin, his gaze moving from face to face, each a story waiting to be told. His presence was both a balm and a threat. Those with nothing to hide drew comfort, while those with secrets felt the walls closing in. Behind him, agents fanned out, their expressions blank, professional. One of them carried a small monitor, its screen dark but humming with potential. "Good afternoon," Hatcher began, his voice carrying through the cabin with a calm authority. "I am Director Paul Hatcher with the Central Intelligence Agency. We are conducting a federal investigation, and I need everyone to remain calm and cooperative." His words hung in the air, each syllable a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading through the passengers. Jessica's breath hitched, the sound small but sharp against the silence. The agents moved methodically, asking passengers to present their IDs, questioning crew members in low tones. Jessica tried to blend in, but her stillness was a stark contrast to the quiet compliance around her. Hatcher's eyes found her, and in that moment she felt seen. Not as a flight attendant, not as an authority figure, but as prey. She forced a smile, a brittle thing that shattered under his gaze. "Miss Malone," he addressed her directly, his tone devoid of accusation, yet heavy with implication. "I need you to step forward, please." She hesitated, the aisle suddenly too narrow, the space around her shrinking. When she finally moved, it was with the careful steps of a tightrope walker, every muscle tensed against the fall. An agent placed the monitor on a tray table, angling it so the entire first-class cabin could see. Hatcher didn't need to say anything. The screen came to life, and the truth unraveled in pixelated clarity. The hidden camera footage played back Jessica's every move. There she was, slipping the package into Naomi's bag, her hands quick but not quick enough. Her expression, once smug and certain, now mirrored back at her with the cold truth of a recorded moment. Passengers gasped. The older woman in the scarf let out a soft, "Oh no," her hand covering her mouth. The businessman's grip on his briefcase tightened again, but this time out of shame. The teenager who had been recording earlier lowered his phone, the lens no longer a weapon but a mirror. Judgment shifted in the cabin, its weight pressing down on Jessica until her knees felt weak. "I didn't..." Jessica's voice cracked, the words thin and brittle. "It's not what it looks like." But the video played on, showing not just her actions but the context. The whispers to another crew member, the exchange of glances, the setup of an elaborate lie. Each frame was a thread pulled from the tapestry of her deception, unraveling it before their eyes. Naomi remained seated, her face calm as if this were simply a movie she had seen before. Her composure was no longer just a defense, but a declaration. She had been right all along, and now everyone saw it. The power dynamics had shifted. The audience that had once been a jury now became witnesses to a crime they had unknowingly abetted with their silent biases. Jessica's composure shattered. "You set me up," she yelled, her voice shrill, bouncing off the cabin walls. "This isn't fair. She's dangerous." Her accusation hung in the air, a desperate attempt to reclaim a narrative that was no longer hers to control. Director Hatcher didn't respond to her outburst. Instead, he turned to Naomi. "Agent Grant," he said, the title a deliberate revelation. "Would you like to add anything?" The cabin froze. "Agent?" The word rippled through the passengers, the shock a tangible force. Naomi finally stood, unfolding herself with a grace that belied the storm beneath. She looked directly at Jessica, her expression one of quiet strength. "The truth always comes out," she said, her voice as steady as it had been in the cell, as it had been when the accusations first flew. "You just made sure everyone could see it." Jessica crumbled. The weight of the truth, of the lies, of the twisting path she had chosen, pressed down until she sank into the seat behind her. Her world, so carefully constructed, had imploded under the gaze of a woman who had needed no force, no threats, only the truth and the patience to let it unfold. The plane, once a vessel for escape, had become the stage for her undoing, and there was nowhere left to go but down. The silence that followed was a living thing, heavy and shifting, wrapping itself around every person in the cabin. The monitor still glowed, paused on the incriminating footage of Jessica planting the drugs, her hand caught mid-motion. The image lingered like an accusation, not just against her, but against everyone who had been so quick to believe her story. The elderly woman in the floral scarf sat rigid, her hands trembling in her lap. Her earlier words echoed in her mind, the casual cruelty of her assumptions replaying over and over. "People like that," she had whispered to her husband, and now the weight of those words crushed her. Tears slipped down her cheeks, slow and silent, as if her body had no choice but to release the shame that pooled within her. She reached for her husband's hand, but he remained still, his own face etched with a quiet sorrow. He had nodded along with her earlier, had shared the small, complicit smile when Jessica had made the accusation. Now they sat adrift, their certainties fractured by the truth. In the row behind them, the young man who had been recording the incident from the start now held his phone steady, but his posture had changed. No longer a spectator, he had become a witness. His live stream, which had initially captured a potential scandal, now broadcast a revelation. He had been part of the problem, fueling the fire, validating the lie. His voice, when he spoke to his followers, was softer, more deliberate. "We were wrong," he said, the admission a thin thread of redemption. "This is what happens when we jump to conclusions. Look at her. She's been calm this whole time, because she knew. She knew the truth would come out." The ripple effect of the truth spread through the cabin. Where there had been judgment, now there was regret. The passengers exchanged glances, each look a confession. They had bought into the story Jessica had spun, not just because of what she said, but because of what they had been conditioned to believe. A black woman in first class, quiet and composed. That had been enough for suspicion to take root. They had let their biases lead them. And now, confronted with the undeniable truth, they felt the sting of their own complicity. A mother pulled her young daughter closer, her hand smoothing the child's hair with a tenderness tinged with apology. She had whispered to the girl earlier, a soft warning to stay away from trouble, her eyes darting toward Naomi. Now, the mother whispered a different lesson, her voice barely above a breath. "We were wrong, sweetheart. I'm sorry." Even the flight crew, who had stood behind Jessica, their solidarity built on the shared culture of the uniform, began to shift uncomfortably. One of the attendants, a young woman with dark curls tucked under her cap, moved to Naomi's side, offering her a bottle of water. Her gesture was small but significant, a bridge of empathy where a wall had stood before. The entire cabin seemed to exhale, the collective breath of a crowd waking from a bad dream. Where there had been isolation, now there was connection, a fragile thread of understanding woven through shared guilt and the hope for redemption. They had witnessed not just a confrontation, but a transformation. The slow, often painful process of seeing the world as it truly was, not as they had always assumed it to be. And as the plane sat grounded, surrounded by the agents of truth, the passengers found themselves grounded too, tethered to a reality they could no longer ignore. As the weight of the truth settled over the cabin, a new voice broke the silence. "There's more," said a soft but steady tone. All eyes turned to Sarah, a young flight attendant whose presence had been a quiet shadow to Jessica's dominance. Her dark curls framed a face marked by hesitation, but also a spark of resolve. Sarah stepped forward, her fingers wrapped tightly around her phone, the screen glowing with evidence. Jessica's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Sarah, what are you doing?" she demanded, her voice laced with a mix of warning and desperation. But the power in her words had dissipated, leaving behind only a hollow echo. Sarah took a breath, grounding herself as she met Director Hatcher's gaze. "I've been recording things for a while now," she began, her voice gaining strength. "I didn't think anyone would believe me without proof, but I couldn't just keep..." The screen displayed grainy footage from the crew lounge. Jessica's voice, unmistakable in its sharpness, filled the cabin. The package will be in the restroom, first class, same as before. Make sure the woman in 3A is distracted, she's the perfect cover. Her tone was casual, the kind of instruction given by someone who had done this many times before. In the video, Sarah could be seen nodding along, her expression tight, the fear in her eyes clear even through the small screen. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the layers of deception deepening with every passing second. Jessica had not only set up Naomi, but had orchestrated a smuggling ring that used bias and prejudice as a smokescreen. Sarah had been a part of it, not by choice but by coercion. The next clip showed Jessica berating Sarah in the galley, her voice a low hiss. "If you want to keep your job, you'll do what I say. You think anyone will believe you over me? You're lucky I even let you in on this." Tears shimmered in Sarah's eyes, but her voice remained steady. "I was scared," she admitted, her confession a blade cutting through her own guilt. "I thought if I just went along, I could avoid trouble. But then I saw what happened to Naomi, and I knew it had gone too far. It was never supposed to be like this." Jessica surged forward, but an agent stepped between them, his hand firm on her shoulder. "You little traitor," Jessica spat, her words venomous but powerless. The agents moved to restrain her, but Sarah stood her ground, her shoulders squaring, as if she had finally found the strength to hold up her own truth. The dynamic in the cabin shifted once more. Where there had been fear, now there was solidarity. Passengers who had felt betrayed by their own assumptions began to see Sarah not as an accomplice, but as another victim who had found the courage to break free. The young man with the camera turned it toward her, his voice filled with newfound respect. "You did the right thing," he said, a simple statement that held the weight of redemption. Sarah's journey from fear to bravery added a new dimension to the unfolding story. She was not just a witness, but a catalyst, her decision to speak up becoming a turning point. Her bravery was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And in that small act, she not only helped bring Jessica to justice, but also began to heal the wounds left by silence and complicity. As Jessica was led away, the passengers' reactions shifted once more, from judgment to regret, and finally to hope. They had seen both the damage caused by prejudice and the power of truth, spoken even through trembling lips. Sarah's stand served as a reminder that redemption was possible, that bravery often wore the quiet face of a young woman who had simply had enough. The aftermath unfolded with the swift efficiency of a well-coordinated operation. Federal agents moved through the cabin, their presence a stark contrast to the earlier chaos. Passengers remained seated, their expressions a blend of shock and relief as Jessica Malone was handcuffed and led down the aisle. Her once impeccable uniform now hung loose, her hair escaping the tight bun in disheveled strands. The veneer of control she had so carefully maintained shattered under the weight of consequence. She muttered denials, her voice cracking, but the cabin's silence swallowed her words. As Jessica was escorted off the plane, 2 other crew members were also taken into custody. Tyler, a baggage handler with a history of disciplinary issues, and Chloe, a flight attendant who had been quietly complicit, were led out with hands behind their backs. Their roles in the smuggling ring became clear as agents uncovered a network of hidden compartments and coded communications. The conspiracy extended beyond a single flight. Shipments had moved through multiple routes, each layer of deception crafted to exploit gaps in airport security and, more insidiously, societal biases. Naomi Grant remained a steady presence amidst the fallout. She moved methodically, assisting agents as they collected evidence, her calmness a balm to the passengers who had been caught in the crossfire. The young man with the phone, still recording but now with a sense of purpose, captured her quiet leadership. "This is what real strength looks like," he whispered to his followers, his earlier eagerness for drama transformed into a genuine search for. Meanwhile, in a starkly lit boardroom at Atlantic Airways headquarters, CEO Richard Evans sat surrounded by his executive team. Monitors on the wall displayed live news feeds, each showing the footage of the arrests, the plane surrounded by law enforcement vehicles, and clips of Naomi's hidden camera footage that had already begun to circulate online. Evan's usually composed demeanor had crumbled under the weight of the situation. His hands were steepled under his chin, eyes fixed on the screen but seeing far beyond it. "This is a disaster," one of the board members muttered, scrolling through social media comments. The airline was being called out for negligence, and worse, for allowing a culture where bias could be weaponized. The hashtag #JusticeForNaomi was trending, accompanied by calls for accountability not only for Jessica Malone, but for the corporate structures that had allowed her behavior to go unchecked. Evans took a breath, his voice breaking the room's heavy silence. "We can't undo what's been done," he said, "but we can control what happens next." He turned to his head of human resources. "I want an immediate review of all flight crew protocols. Any complaints, past or present, need to be re-examined. And I don't want this handled internally. Bring in an independent auditor, someone with credibility and no ties to our organization." He shifted his attention to the head of public relations. "Our first statement should be an apology. No spin, no excuses. We admit our failure and we outline our plan to fix it. Anti-bias training for all staff, not just frontline employees but executives too. New security protocols that prevent this kind of exploitation. And I want Naomi Grant involved. If she's willing, I want her consulting on every step of this process." The executives exchanged glances, some wary, others visibly relieved. Evans' shift from denial to reform was not just a reaction to public outrage, but a genuine acknowledgement of the systemic issues within his company. "We need to rebuild trust," he continued. "Not with words, but with actions. And those actions start now." Back at the airport, the passengers finally began to disembark. Many paused to thank Naomi, their gratitude laced with lingering guilt. The elderly woman in the floral scarf squeezed Naomi's hand, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and though the apology could not erase what had been, Naomi accepted it with a gentle nod. "It's never too late to do the right thing," she replied, offering the woman a small, genuine smile. Sarah, the young flight attendant who had bravely exposed Jessica, stood near the terminal exit. Her posture was more upright now. The weight of her silence finally lifted. As Naomi approached, Sarah straightened, a question in her eyes. Did I do enough?" she asked, her voice thin with the echoes of doubt. Naomi placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture both grounding and empowering. "You did more than enough. You found your voice when it mattered most. That's the hardest part." The words wrapped around Sarah like a blanket, offering warmth and protection. It was a moment of redemption, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who had chosen to confront their own biases. The story spread quickly, not just as a tale of scandal, but as a narrative of transformation. Atlantic Airways announced its new initiatives, partnering with civil rights organizations to develop training programs and creating a passenger advocacy board. Richard Evans held a press conference where, instead of deflecting blame, he stood beside Naomi and Sarah, giving them the platform to share their experiences. His promise to rebuild from the ground up was met with cautious optimism, his actions speaking louder than any prepared statement could. For Naomi, the aftermath was not an ending but a continuation of her mission. She had not only dismantled a smuggling ring, but had also shone a light on the deeper shadows cast by prejudice. Her work with the airline's reform committee became a blueprint for change, influencing not just policies but mindsets. She had turned a moment of injustice into a movement of awareness, proving that true strength lay not in the absence of fear, but in the courage to confront it head-on. As the airport quieted and the last agents filed out, Naomi stood by the terminal windows. The storm outside had cleared and the runway lights glowed against the night sky. It was a new beginning, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed the truth unfold. And as she prepared for her next assignment, Naomi knew that this victory, like all victories rooted in truth, would ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the walls of that plane. As the story unfolds to its final chapter, the camera shifts focus, Not just on Naomi, Sarah, or the humbled faces of the passengers, but on you, the viewer. This isn't just a story of a flight gone wrong or a plot twist that turned prejudice into justice. It's a mirror, reflecting back at each of us, asking quietly but insistently, what would you have done if you were on that plane? We've all been there, haven't we? Sitting in the safety of our own silence, watching a situation unfold and wondering if we should say something. Maybe it was a moment on the subway when someone muttered a slur under their breath and you pretended not to hear. Perhaps it was in the office, a joke that landed wrong, and you laughed along because it was easier. Or it might have been in school, when you saw someone being singled out and you chose the comfort of blending into the crowd over the courage to step forward. This story isn't just about calling out the Jessica Malones of the world. It's about recognizing that we all play a part in the stories around us, whether as heroes, bystanders, or sometimes unintentional villains. It's not always about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it's as simple as questioning our first impressions, pausing before passing judgment, or choosing kindness when the world expects indifference. Maybe you've been a Sarah, scared, uncertain, but brave enough to find your voice when it mattered. Or perhaps you've felt like one of those passengers, swept up in a narrative only to realize too late that you were on the wrong side of the story. And if you've been Naomi, if you've sat quietly while others painted you as something you're not, holding your truth close until the world caught up, know that your strength is a light in dark places. We're all human. We make mistakes. We learn. And the best stories are not just the ones where the truth comes out, but where change takes root. Where the ending is not a period but a comma, leading to a new sentence, a fresh start. The truth is, each of us has a story worth telling. And sometimes, sharing it is the first step to healing, to understanding, to building bridges where walls once stood. So, here's an invitation. Not just to listen, but to share. Tell us about a time when you stood up for someone, or when you wished you had. Share a moment when you felt misunderstood, or when you found the courage to see beyond a first impression. Your words might be the encouragement someone else needs to find their own voice. This isn't about likes or shares, it's about connection, about starting conversations that matter, about being part of a community where stories are not just told but felt, where truth isn't just heard but held. And if this story has sparked something in you, a thought, a memory, a question, don't let it fade away. Write it down. Send it out into the world. You never know whose life it might touch. Thank you for being here, for listening, for feeling. Stay curious, stay kind, and most importantly, stay willing to see the world through someone else's eyes, because that's where real change begins. Not on a plane, not in a courtroom, but right here with all of us, choosing to listen and choosing to learn. In the months that followed, Naomi Grant became more than a headline. Her story evolved from a viral moment into a movement, a catalyst for deeper conversations and tangible change. While the footage of her calm defiance and Jessica's unraveling circulated online, Naomi remained steadfastly focused on the bigger picture. She had always been driven by more than just clearing her own name. Her mission extended to exposing the broader systems that allowed prejudice to fester and become a tool for manipulation. When Atlantic Airways approached her to lead their newly established Diversity and Inclusion Task Force, Naomi agreed on one condition: that her involvement would not be a marketing ploy but a genuine effort to create lasting change. CEO Richard Evans, humbled by the public backlash and his own missteps, granted her full autonomy. Together, they crafted programs that went beyond the typical corporate seminars. They introduced immersive training that put employees in real-world scenarios, challenging their biases and building empathy from experience, not just lectures. Naomi's focus was not only on staff training but also on structural reform. She pushed for changes in hiring practices, creating opportunities for underrepresented voices within the airline industry. She helped implement anonymous reporting systems that allowed employees and passengers to share concerns without fear of retaliation. And most importantly, She worked to ensure that no one would ever have to feel as isolated as she had in that first-class seat. Beyond the airline, Naomi took her advocacy to a national stage. She partnered with civil rights organizations, contributing to policy discussions about racial profiling and discrimination in travel and public spaces. Her voice became a steady presence in documentaries, panel discussions, and educational videos used in schools and workplaces. She shared her story not as a tale of victimhood, but as a blueprint for resilience and reform. The impact of her work rippled outward. Other airlines began to adopt similar anti-bias training and security protocols, recognizing that what happened on that flight was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a larger issue. Lawmakers proposed new guidelines for how accusations were handled on commercial flights, ensuring that due process and clear procedures would prevent innocent people from being wrongfully targeted. Naomi's advocacy also inspired grassroots movements. People who had once felt voiceless began sharing their own experiences. Hashtags like "Truth Takes Flight" and "Justice in Air" trended, creating online spaces where stories of injustice found support and solidarity. Her journey showed that real change wasn't just about tearing down what was wrong, but about building up what was right. Even the passengers from that fateful flight played their part. The young man who had recorded the incident became a vocal ally, using his platform to amplify stories of racial bias and the importance of standing up in real time. The elderly woman who had whispered her regrets to Naomi reached out privately, dedicating her time to community programs that promoted dialogue and understanding. Each of them became a thread in the larger tapestry of change, their small acts of redemption contributing to a broader culture shift. Through it all, Naomi remained grounded. She often returned to her roots, speaking at schools on the south side of Chicago, where young students looked up at her with wide eyes, seeing not just a successful woman, but a reflection of their own potential. She reminded them that strength came from staying true to who they were, even when the world tried to write a different story over theirs. Her work was not without challenges. There were setbacks, pushbacks from those resistant to change, and moments when progress seemed painfully slow. But Naomi's perseverance was unwavering. She knew that systemic change was not a sprint, but a marathon, and every step forward mattered. Her story had started on a plane, a confined space filled with tension and bias. But it spread far beyond those narrow aisles, touching lives, influencing policies, and opening eyes. Naomi turned her personal experience into a public lesson, proving that the real power of truth was not just in its ability to expose, but in its potential to transform. Naomi Grant stood at the podium, her presence commanding yet approachable. The press conference room was filled with reporters, cameras, and community leaders, all waiting to hear from the woman whose story had ignited a national conversation. The backdrop behind her displayed the Atlantic Airways logo alongside the seal of a new initiative, Equity in the Air. The title was not just a promise, but a blueprint for change, a symbol of the journey from injustice to reform. She began not with the dramatic events on the plane, but with a simple truth. "We all see the world through our own lens," she said, her voice steady. "But when that lens is clouded by prejudice, it distorts reality, not just for us, but for those around us." Her words hung in the air, each syllable carefully chosen. There was no anger, only a firm resolve that drew everyone in. Naomi spoke of the incident not as an isolated event, but as part of a broader pattern. "What happened to me was not new. Many face this kind of judgment every day, in airports, in schools, in workplaces. The difference is, I had a platform to show the truth. Not everyone is that fortunate." She paused, allowing the weight of her message to settle. Faces in the audience shifted, some with discomfort, others with quiet recognition. Her story was not about blame, but about understanding. Bias isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers. It slips into decisions and hides in plain sight. It tells us a story before we've even met the person standing in front of us. And if we're not careful, it turns good people into bystanders, or worse, accomplices to injustice. She shared how the moment on the plane became a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone involved. She praised the passengers who reflected on their actions, who reached out to her, not just to apologize, but to learn. She spoke of Sarah, the young flight attendant who found her courage, and of Richard Evans, the CEO who chose the harder path of accountability over damage control. Their stories, she explained, were proof that change was possible when honesty met humility. Her words turned to action. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's a good thing. Discomfort is often the first step toward growth. I invite everyone listening, not just in this room but wherever this story reaches, to take a moment of reflection. Ask yourself, when have I let assumptions guide me? When have I stayed silent when my voice was needed? Naomi ended not with a call for applause, but a call for introspection. Real change starts not with grand gestures, but with quiet choices. It happens when we decide to look at the world and each other with clearer eyes. When we listen more, judge less, and stand up, not just for ourselves, but for those whose voices are often drowned out. The room remained still, a collective pause as her message settled into the hearts of those present. And as the cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment, it was clear that Naomi's story had become more than a headline. It was now a chapter in a larger narrative, one that challenged everyone to be a part of the change they wished to see. In the weeks following Jessica Malone's arrest, investigators began to unravel a story that added a chilling complexity to her actions. During an interrogation, as the reality of her situation set in, Jessica broke down. Her carefully constructed mask of arrogance and control crumbled, revealing a fractured woman beneath. The real story began to emerge, one rooted not just in greed, but in pain. Jessica's younger brother Adam had struggled with addiction for most of his life. She recounted how their childhood had been a constant cycle of hope and heartbreak. Adam had been bright, full of promise, but somewhere along the way he had fallen through the cracks. She described the night she found him, pale and unconscious, a bottle of prescription pills still clutched in his hand. He survived, but the boy she had known was gone, replaced by someone she couldn't reach. The turning point came when Adam was arrested, not for dealing, not for theft, but for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. She watched as he was paraded in front of cameras, a cautionary tale of a dangerous youth. But while her brother faced the full weight of the law, she saw others, richer, whiter, walk free with a slap on the wrist. The injustice of it twisted something inside her, but instead of seeking healing, she sought control. Jessica's logic became warped. She rationalized that if she could target the real threats, those she deemed suspicious, those who fit her twisted narrative of danger, then maybe she could make up for the system's failures. She began to see her actions not as exploitation, but as a necessary cleansing. Her biases filled the gaps where her grief and trauma festered, and she built a narrative where she was not just justified, but righteous. This revelation didn't absolve her. It did not undo the harm she caused or the lives she disrupted, but it shed light on how trauma could twist a person's worldview, how pain left untreated could become a weapon. It reminded everyone watching that injustice often wears many masks, and that healing, like prejudice, starts from within. Jessica's story became a cautionary tale not just of crime, but of how unaddressed wounds could lead a person down a dangerous path. Naomi stood in front of the audience, her eyes calm but piercing, as if looking beyond the room and into the hearts of everyone watching. Her voice, steady and resonant, cut through the silence. "What if your first impression of someone is wrong?" she asked. "How often do we let our biases write a story that was never true to begin with?" She let the question settle, allowing the weight of it to sink in. The room remained still, and even through the cameras her words reached living rooms, offices, and phones, prompting a moment of reflection in every listener. She wasn't looking for an immediate answer. She knew the most important questions often needed to echo within a person before they found a voice. The narrator's voice returned, not with the high-energy tone of a traditional sign-off, but with a warmth, that felt more like a conversation with a trusted friend. Stories like this aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to spark something within us. If this story touched you, if it opened your eyes, share it. Share it with someone who might need to hear it, with someone who feels unseen, or with someone who could use a reminder that every story has more than one side. Sometimes, the most powerful change starts not with action, but with a conversation. And if you're curious about more stories that challenge the status quo, you know where to find us. Stay thoughtful, stay engaged, and keep questioning what you see, because the truth isn't always what it seems, and it's up to each of us to look closer, to listen deeper, and to make sure the stories we tell are ones worth sharing. The screen faded slowly, leaving behind not just the story, but a lingering sense of purpose. The invitation was clear, not just to watch, but to become part of a movement, where every shared truth built a bridge toward understanding, and every thoughtful question became a step toward change. As the story reached its natural conclusion, the screen began to fade, the images gently dissolving into darkness. There were no dramatic cuts or sweeping music, just a soft, ambient hum that echoed the quiet reflection of a world still turning. The story had been told, but its echoes lingered, each viewer left alone with their thoughts, their own biases, and perhaps a newfound perspective. A simple yet powerful message appeared against the black screen. Justice isn't just what happens in the courtroom. It's what happens when we choose truth over prejudice, courage over comfort. Thank you for being a part of this journey toward a more just world. The words settled like a gentle whisper, a reminder that the real impact of justice often unfolds not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, everyday choices we make. The video did not end with a flashy logo or a call to subscribe. Instead, the final moments were filled with the sounds of life, the rustle of leaves in a soft breeze, the distant chatter of voices, the rhythmic pulse of city life continuing on. These sounds served as a grounding force, a reminder that while the story had been an intense and crafted narrative, it was not far removed from reality. In many ways, it was a mirror held up to society, reflecting both its flaws and its potential for redemption. This choice of a quiet, reflective ending allowed the story's message to breathe. It created space for viewers to process what they had seen, to let it sink in, and to find their own place within the narrative. Whether it was a moment of introspection, a conversation with a loved one, or a simple shift in perspective, the story's true power lay not in how it ended, but in what it might inspire next. The screen remained dark for a moment longer than expected, allowing the audience to linger in that quiet space. It felt almost like an exhale, a release of all the tension and emotion that had built up. And as the ambient sounds slowly faded, the world beyond the screen came back into focus. Subtly different, perhaps, as if a thin veil had been lifted. For those who sat with the story until the very end, it became more than just a video. It was an experience, a shared moment of truth that extended beyond the screen. And as the final pixel dimmed, the story found new life, carried forward by each viewer. One conversation, one choice, and one act of quiet courage at a time. As the screen remained dark, the gentle ambient sounds of life continued to play softly. The moment lingered, allowing the weight of the story to resonate in the quiet spaces of each viewer's mind. Then, in a voice that felt more like a confidant than a narrator, the closing words slipped through with a quiet power. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it challenged your perspective, take that feeling and share it. Not just with a like or a click, but in the conversations you have, the choices you make, and the compassion you show. Sometimes, the most profound change starts with a story, a single voice speaking a truth that many need to hear. And if you're looking for more stories that inspire courage, spark change, and remind us of the dignity we all deserve, stay with us. There's more to come, and you are a part of this journey. The invitation wasn't a demand, but a gentle nudge, a reminder that the world changes, not through grand gestures alone, but through the small, everyday acts of empathy and awareness. It was an acknowledgement that each viewer held the potential to contribute to a culture where dignity is not just a right, but a shared responsibility. The final note was one of gratitude, not just for watching, but for being present, for allowing the story to unfold in their hearts and minds. Thank you for being here, for listening, for feeling, and for being part of a world where truth and justice matter. Stay thoughtful, stay engaged, and as always, keep looking deeper. The story may end here, but the impact is just beginning. A soft fade to black, the ambient sound slowly receded, leaving a quiet that felt full, not empty. The kind of silence that holds space for new thoughts, new understandings, and the start of something real and lasting. And with that, the story was no longer just a narrative. It was a call to action, woven seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life.